So Jesse was kind enough, as many people probably saw in the news over the course of the past couple of weeks. Deerhurst had the unfortunate incident of dealing with a COVID outbreak, although nothing really happened at Deerhurst. It all happened outside of that, but he had the absolute pleasure of working with the health unit and going through that process. And he was kind enough to be able to come on to this call and share that experience so that we could be better prepared as an organization that it should something happen at our own individual properties. So Jesse, we completely appreciate you coming on and sharing that experience, and any best practices that we can learn from that will be greatly appreciated. So over to you.
You just have to unmute your mic there, Jesse. Okay.
Wait, I'll get him.
Can he do it?
I'm trying to, but it's not letting me. Jesse, you may have to unmute your mic.
You want to write it?
Did that work? Oh yes, that worked. Hello.
Got it.
There we go. Now we can hear you.
Fantastic. I thought you had muted. I guess I was unmuted on my own accord. So good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me join you today. Earlier, Jerry referred to this as a speech, which scared me because I haven't done a speech in a long time. But this is just more the sharing of the story for everyone, because I think from what I can tell and from what I'm hearing, all of the resorts across our province are very well prepared, as we were, for this to happen. But there are some things that you learn if it happens that I don't think you learn until it happens. So I just thought I might spend 10 or 15 minutes just taking you sort of through what the story at Deerhurst looked like and sharing with you some of the points that we learned from, because I think it will help others out there if you're ever in the unfortunate position that we were in. And then I'm happy to answer any questions that people might have. So if that's okay, I'll just jump in and do that. So August 1st to 3rd was the weekend in question, the busiest weekend that Deerhurst had yet to date this summer, of course. And we ended up having 30 guests who traveled together, and they were individual families who booked all in different ways. So, directly, hotels.com, etc. We didn't know that they were a group that was traveling together, and they made the unfortunate decision to increase their bubble size from individual families to what became a big bubble of 30 people. And so, I think the first opportunity for us to sort of learn from that is this was a great example of how much we need to rely on our guests as resort operators to do the right thing. And to make good decisions, not just for themselves, but for guests who are with them and for our hosts that are working. And, much like I'm sure all the other resorts out there, we have protocols for groups that are coming to the resort. But this was just an example of families that booked individually and didn't really disclose what their intentions were. So that's how the situation sort of came to be. They were here and they were gone. And on the Thursday after their departure, we received an email sort of later in the day through hotels.com. It was very cryptic, and it said, "We were at your resort on the weekend. A child that was with us has tested positive for COVID. Thought you'd like to know." And that was it. And so that was received by a reservations agent, was passed on to a reservations manager, was passed on to our director of operations, and then passed on to me. And so what we did was call the health unit immediately and said, "This is the email we've received. What should we do?" And they said, "You should do nothing, because there's not an official case. It's not being traced back to Deerhurst. We know nothing about it." And this is our local health unit to Simcoe, Muskoka. And so we said, "Okay, we'll do nothing." And they said, "If this is an actual case and there's actual concern for you, you will hear from us." So what we did do at that moment, though, which I think has been sort of hotly debated at the resort but in my opinion, we wouldn't have done anything differently, is within minutes that began to spread around our staff, because a reservations agent, reservations manager, director of operations, you can't stop the information. So we immediately sent a message out to our staff, letting them know what we knew at that point in time, which was almost nothing. We said, we've received an email, somebody says somebody's tested positive for COVID, the health department has told us to do nothing, and we want you as our staff to know. And so, you know, I feel like telling our staff right away was the right thing to do. But that moment in time was when the misinformation started. So, you know, our director of marketing, Laura Kennedy, has always said to me, if you're saying it to our team, you're saying it to the world at large. And so, but now in this day and age, one of the interesting things that happened was one of our staff members took a picture of the email and put it on Snapchat. So, so within, you know, minutes of us sharing this information with our staff, it was sort of public knowledge, and it was sort of shared amongst everybody who could hear about it. So that the problem started pretty quickly for us in terms of trying to help our staff feel comfortable at work, let them know that we didn't even know if there was a case, but that sort of theme of staff members feeling uneasy and concerned and, you know, not coming into work, and even suggesting we were keeping information from them when we weren't, that's a pretty, I think, reasonable and natural thing to have happen, but that happened pretty early on for us. Fast forward 2 days to the evening of that Sunday, so we're a week away now from when the guests departed. Our local health unit called us later on in that afternoon around 6 o'clock and said, a case has been opened. One person has been contact traced to Deerhurst, who's tested positive for COVID in their home community. And we said again, okay, what does that mean and what do we do? And they said, you do nothing. You'll have more information shared with you when we have it, and simply stay tuned. So we did. In less than 24 hours, we received some more information and some more details. And sort of from that Monday through to the Wednesday, constant contact with the health unit as the numbers were growing. And the numbers were growing solely because this group was traveling together. And so that's became problematic for us, because it allowed misinformation to spread about guests getting it from one another at the resort, which was in fact not true at all. It was a family spreading it amongst themselves. I'll back up, because the other thing that we did do, which in hindsight isn't a learning opportunity and something that I wouldn't have done now that I know what I know, from the email that we received, this cryptic email, we were able to use the last name and the email address to determine 2 rooms that we thought the guests were staying in. And so immediately we contacted the room attendants, the housekeepers, and let them know and asked them to quarantine. And so we started some concern amongst our staff that we didn't need to, because what actually ended up happening when we were in contact with the health department on that Monday, Tuesday, there was zero concern about our housekeeping team. And this was an important piece of information for me. There was no concern about them contracting COVID from the guest room, even though they were cleaning it in the same day actually that those guests had left. Housekeepers had been in there to start cleaning. There was no concern about them getting it from door handles, from wiping down countertops, nothing. And so to me, that's always been the message in the media, is you can get it from all of those places. And we overreacted knowing what we know now, but at that time we thought those 2 people are clearly potentially at risk. We want to let them know right away. So they were quarantined on our behalf, not on the health unit's behalf. And that obviously got our staff concerned and worried before we had enough information to help them understand what the process actually needed to look like. So I think that's one of the takeaways that we learned, is that position, which seems, I think, to many people, one that's at high risk, it's not deemed to be at high risk by the health department. And of course, those 2 employees who we asked to quarantine and get tests came back with negative tests and came back to work. What did happen when we were speaking with the health department is, at first we knew there was 1 person, and then there was a number of people. And within sort of 48 hours from them contacting us, there was 11, all within that same group of people. And what they essentially did was they interviewed those guests, And again, we don't know where they live. That wasn't disclosed to us. We don't know what their home health unit is. That wasn't disclosed to us. We don't know what guest rooms they stayed in. None of that's disclosed to you. What happens is their health unit reports to our health unit, and then our health unit manages the investigation on that part of the contact tracing. So they indicated, based on their interviews with those guests, that there were some periods in time that they had some concern about. They were restaurant visits, and there was visits to the pool. Those are the only two opportunities that they believed were for transmission, if in fact they were even sick while they were here. We ended up providing the health unit with the list of 8 names of employees. And these were people based on the descriptions they gave us of when they were eating or when they were in the pool. And the health unit does interviews directly with those employees. We asked their permission to let the employees know in advance that they were getting a phone call. They had no problem with that. Those phone calls seemed almost immediate. They were able to get a hold of our employees very quickly. And they deemed that there was only one employee who was at risk due to prolonged exposure to these guests. She had served them breakfast. She had all the PPE on that she would need to have on to be safe. But because she was serving them their entire meal, that means she was within, closer than 2 meters for prolonged periods of time. So that employee was asked to quarantine and to get a COVID test. So that was the only outcome. We've heard about this app that the government's asking us all to put in our phones in our pocket, and it tells us when we walk by somebody if they've had COVID before. And so it seemed a little strange at first that they weren't concerned if these guests had walked by somebody, walked by an employee, walked by a guest, but that was of no concern to the health unit. And I think part of that is based on the assumption that if everybody in any resort is doing what they're supposed to do, and the resort hotel is doing what they're supposed to do, there's really no fear of transmission as people walk by one another. But the general public doesn't feel that way, and we certainly, learned that as things move forward. So what we did do is on that Monday, when we had some details and we knew for sure it was us, we put out a very brief statement because we didn't want to be seen as hiding that information. But at the same time, we didn't have a lot of information to share. So we put out a statement saying that there has been contact tracing and those guests did stay at Deerhurst Resort. That was pretty much the extent of what we had said. There was no reason for the resort to close down, no concerns about transmission from the health unit's perspective. And we also were told that it wasn't necessary for us to start communicating to guests. And that was a bit of a tough decision for us because what is right? What are you supposed to do? But we also started to learn that part of the reason why we're not instructed to inform everybody that this happened is because they don't want a whole bunch of people who are at the resort who don't have any reason to be concerned, start flooding testing centers and acting like there's something wrong that isn't really wrong. So we put out that first statement on that Monday. And then it was on the Wednesday when we had enough information to share. We had the support of the health unit in terms of knowing what information was right and wrong. We put out a proper statement with a lot more details. We put that out late Wednesday evening. So now this is almost a week and a half from when they were at the resort, but only just under a week from when they tested positive. And we put out some more information the following day because, as you can imagine, we got flooded with questions. So we put out sort of an addition to that statement on the Thursday morning. So what I can tell you is between the statement we put out on Monday and the statement we put out on Thursday morning, in that short period of time, we lost $250,000 in bookings for the month of August alone, and had 20 employees quit. And so the impact of the misinformation, it's huge. And so, it doesn't really matter what size your resort operation is. You take those percentages and, it would still hit a small, $250,000. You adjust it for a smaller resort, it's still going to feel as painful as that $250,000 feels to Deerhurst. And I would suggest that is all a result of the media's desire to pitch this as an outbreak. And, in the olden days, I guess it's what sold newspapers. Nowadays, it's what buys clicks, I suppose. But, that's really what the journey looked like for us. When when it was all said and done, so last Thursday, a week yesterday, our health unit said there was no transmission in Muskoka. There was no transmission at Deerhurst Resort. This was not an outbreak. And we were waiting for those words. They were saying things like that to us before Thursday, but when they made it official, not one news outlet picked it up, which is unfortunate because everyone picked up the fact that there was potentially an outbreak, but not one person said, hey, here's some great news. There was no outbreak. So I think, when I look back at it, we had to share with the health department all the things that we had been doing, what kind of chemicals we're using. There were some media outlets that did speak very favorably about the fact that the health unit recognized that we were doing exactly what we should be doing and playing our part in keeping people safe, and that was really a good news story. When I look back at it, there's not much that we could have done differently, but learning that having somebody possibly have COVID at the resort doesn't mean your resort closes down. That was a learning experience for us, because that was kind of our approach originally. Was we didn't have a fully thought out plan for what happens. We had a lot of discussions about what it likely looks like, and we were expecting maybe having to close down the resort. And I think a greater close down or impact really hinged on whether or not that one employee tested positive or negative. If she had tested positive, obviously there would have been tracing through our resort with fellow employees, et cetera, and that could have been more problematic. But the good news story is that everything that we were doing at work to surround that employee and keep her safe did that if in fact these people were sick while they were here, and we still don't know that. Two other things that I might share: the opinions of our guests and what we should and shouldn't have done was probably the most challenging thing to deal with. They certainly didn't like getting information from any level of management other than myself or our director of operations. And so, I think between the two of us, Steve and I, made about 200 phone calls to guests who wanted to voice their concern that we had made decisions on their behalf, and how dare we do that, and how dare we not disclose what was happening. One of the strangest things is we had many guests who were asking questions, trying to determine who the guests were. So people who stayed on that weekend had an opinion that they thought it was this family or that family, and they were trying to ask questions to deduce who it was. And I don't know why, if they felt it would just make them feel better to have someone to blame. So that was really interesting to try to deal with this sort of blame game that people wanted to play. Not knowing the room numbers or where they were staying allowed guests to think we were holding back information, and they were quite angry at us for doing that. Some said it's nobody's job but theirs as a guest to decide what they do. The health unit isn't allowed to do that. The province shouldn't be doing that. The resort shouldn't be doing that. They should make their own decisions. And I can understand why everybody was feeling the way that they were feeling, but we dealt with that, I think, with a lot of guests that's saying, look, us calling you and telling you that somebody had potentially had COVID here a week ago is no different than me calling the guests who are arriving all tomorrow and saying, hey, I'd just like to let you know that by leaving your house and by driving to a resort and by spending time at a resort, you're putting yourself at risk in a way that's different than staying locked in your own house. And so it was just managing the guest was very, very difficult. And I think what we learned is that their opinions are, you should be disclosing this to everybody who ever sets foot in your resort. Your resort should be closing. Why, yelling at us for why the information they hear on TV doesn't match what the health unit was sort of saying. So if this was ever to happen to anyone else, and I hope it doesn't, that's still going to be a challenge for you, because there's always going to be a gap between what really has to happen and what we think should be happening out there. And there's always going to be a spectrum of people who, those who are still sanitizing the groceries and leaving them in the garage for 3 days before they put them in the pantry, and those who are just, throwing it in the pantry right away. That sort of spectrum will always exist. And so I think that was a very big challenge for us. But I still stand behind how we communicated, what we communicated. And I do feel like the health unit was asking us to communicate in a certain way because it was what they wanted to have help them manage case numbers. The other thing, which was a major surprise for me, sort of a side of it that was and a side that it wasn't, the local population, a group of them got quite upset, but that's the same group of people who in cottage country anywhere are upset about people traveling from city centers and potentially putting people at risk. But our staff, myself included, spent about a week or so actually feeling ostracized by people in our town and even outside of our town. So, we have employees who have kids who are working, and their kids were called and said, you can't come to work because there was COVID at your mom or dad's workplace. Wasn't even true. The health department didn't require that for them. But you imagine, and I'm using younger people because to be somebody who's got their first summer job and being told you can't come to work, that's pretty impactful and pretty upsetting for them when all their friends are at work and finding out about it. We had employees who were in no way at risk because nobody was, who have second jobs who were told they can't come to work and they needed to quarantine and get a test. But we were saying you don't need to quarantine or get a test. So we were allowing them to come to Deerhurst to work, but their other employer was telling them not to come to work for 14 days. We had an employee who was fired from their other job as a result of it. We had employees who, were scheduled to go to a socially distant hangout in somebody's front yard with their neighbors, and their neighbor called them and said, don't come today. So this was, not what we were expecting. I went to a restaurant. I know the owner. When I got there, I felt like the last thing the owner wanted me to do was actually go to their restaurant that night. So, you can't blame anybody for acting out of fear, I suppose, but that was not part of the process that I really expected to have happen. And the other thing I'll mention, the 20 employees who we lost, because I think that's an important part of this story to understand as well. There are three categories of those employees. There was a group who were, older in age, and they said, what? I knew that there were some risks. This has made me worried. I feel like, my risk is higher of being sick if I do get it. So they quit. And we've had conversations with them about you don't have to quit. You can just take the time off. That's okay. But they chose not to. And then the other group, you can break down into two groups. They were younger employees, seasonal employees. And they, with all due respect, they used COVID, some of them, as an opportunity to quit their jobs without offending anybody and get the rest of their summer back. And the other group of younger employees, they quit because their parents demanded that they quit. And so there was a number of younger people who said, I don't want to quit, but my mom and dad are telling me I have no choice. I have to come home now because it's now scary up there. So that's what our journey looked like. I can tell you, just like most news cycles, though, once this one took longer than I would have liked, but once it was behind us, it was as if it never existed with our guests. I think it took us another week after that first week, so 2 full weeks before things had calmed down on the resort. Our September bookings are pacing incredibly well, probably like everybody else's are. It hasn't slowed us down there. But I can tell you, we never made up that 250 grand for the month of August. That has sort of stalled out entirely, and sort of that is what it is. But, so whatever that's worth, I hope there's something in there that people can learn from, or maybe find some peace in. But if there's any questions or anything that I didn't cover that you wish I had covered, I'd be happy to answer them.
That's amazing. Thanks, Jesse. Really appreciate you telling that story. Not a speech.
Yeah.
We will open the floor up to any questions. So there is a question area that you can submit your questions to. If anyone has any questions. In the meantime, Jesse, one question I have that maybe you could share. What were all of the things that you were asked for by the health department, to provide, from a contact tracing or I know you'd mentioned that they wanted to know your procedures and what chemicals you were using. Was there a list of information that was there that they were asking for?
No, there wasn't. And I mean, this is in no way a negative about the health department. I think, you know, everything is just constantly changing. So really what it was it was a number of phone calls where they would ask us for a piece of information, we would provide it. They'd call back an hour later wanting another piece of information. So at this point in time, our health unit didn't have a playbook or a protocol that they submitted and said, answer these questions, provide us with these things. They asked for a detailed rundown of all of our policies and procedures, which we did with them over the telephone, and start from finish. We explained every department, what every department's doing, all of the guest-facing protections and PPE. We shared those with them. We did share a training document that we send out to our staff as well, to let staff know what they should do, symptoms they're looking for, those types of things as well. You know, when they were asking about chemicals, that was as simple as our housekeeping manager and somebody from our kitchen just submitting an email to us that we sent to them to explain what those chemicals were. So it wasn't a very clear process at the time. My guess is if it happens again, it probably will be clear because they've sort of worked through it with us, I think. The only piece of feedback that they gave us, and we did do something with it, is the way that we handled our training, and in terms of our employees being aware of symptoms, is we trained them when they start. So when everybody was coming back from layoffs, and then when new employees are joining our team, there was a very specific training document that we took them through, outlining what the symptoms were, you know, what to do if you suspect somebody does have symptoms, what to do if you have symptoms, who to communicate with, what it will look like. All of that was shared with our hosts, and we asked them to sign off on that training, so we had, you know, record of them understanding it. But we didn't have a process for our employees where they had to sign in every day and say, I'm not sick. And so the health unit did say, you know, the best practice is to remind your employees on a daily basis of what they're looking for. And so what we did immediately was we sent out an email to our team reminding them, and HR is doing that on a weekly basis right now, but we still haven't adopted the policy of hand-holding our employees to the point that they walk in, we say, do you know what a fever looks like? Do you know what a runny nose feels like? Do you know what a sore throat feels like? That was the only feedback we got from them when we provided them with our protocols.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
I don't know if I can see where the questions are, or if you'll just tell me if there's questions.
Yeah,
There haven't been any questions yet.
You have some? Perfect. Shane,
No, we don't have any questions yet.
Oh no, okay. I was going to say I don't see any questions, so your story must have been well thought out and well delivered, because you've answered everybody's questions. So
that's great. I'm glad that I did. I don't know.
There's one question here.
There is a question.
We got a question. How did you handle the request for disclosing the guest identity or room identity?
So we got that question a lot. What we were able to do was, with the health department, we got their agreement that because we have numerous buildings. So we got to a point where we said to them, look, can we share the building that they were in? Because they were in a building that only houses about 25% of our guests. And so 75% of our guests who were asking, where did they stay? We could say to them, they didn't stay in your building, and the phone call would end. They'd say, great, thank you, I appreciate it, goodbye. So we did get the health department's agreement that we could do that. I don't know how that would impact resorts or hotels that are just one building. So, you know, we would say to the guest, we don't know where they stayed, because that was the truth. The health department is not disclosing that information due to confidentiality. With some guests, you would say to them, and I'm sure that you could understand that, because if this was you or your family, you certainly wouldn't want it to be somebody else's business either. And so we relied on the fact that the health department hadn't disclosed that information to us. By getting the building they were in, we could reduce the amount of sort of more upset people by 75%, essentially, if that was what they were looking for. But, you know, I would say there were more than a handful of people who understood that to be a lie. And they said, that's not the truth. it's impossible that you wouldn't know where they stayed, and you're just holding out on me. There was even a few guests that I talked to who said, that must mean they stayed in my room, and now I'm even madder. And so it was interesting because their hands were tied a little bit, but Steve and I, who were handling most of the conversations, and we did prepare our front line with the ability to answer the question about which building they were in as well. You had to work through it, and every day we would say, it's fear, it's the unknown, it's all these weird feelings that a guest doesn't normally have that's having them sort of act out against us. But really, you just relied on the facts that the health department didn't disclose it to us. And we also didn't try overly hard to do the deduction of it ourselves, because we didn't want to put ourselves in the position of having information we weren't supposed to have, or at some point it being seen like we were trying to retaliate even against those guests, because it's also a pretty reasonable thing to start off by feeling kind of mad at them, because their behavior, wasn't appropriate in terms of that bubble. So, but that's how we handled it. It was just relying on the fact that it was the health department that didn't share the information with us.
Okay, we got another question here, Jesse.
Sure.
How did this affect your social media channels, and how did you deal with the responses?
Yeah, so we let the responses flood in for a day or two without saying anything. And those people who are quickest to respond are those who have negative things to say. And so that was tough on us, on our leadership group. It was tough on our employees who feel proud to work here. They go on Facebook, they can see what people are saying when we put out a statement. I find that the news articles, the local news articles, get more responses than our official posts. But essentially what we ended up doing was, the first thing we did is, because we had gotten so many questions or comments and some negativity around our first press release, we sent out some clarification on it the following day. And that's not a normal thing to do. You don't normally put out a press release and then put out one that follows it with more information. But so we used that as an opportunity to respond to a lot of the negativity or the questions all at once. And then Laura went through those responses, and we responded to a number of them that we felt we could respond to in a way that would benefit everybody from hearing what we had to say. But we didn't, we obviously didn't engage in any of, what can be seen as sort of keyboard warriors and a little bit of bullying and all that stuff that happens online. We didn't really participate in that. But I would say, the biggest impact, all of the cancellations were people who were concerned. We didn't receive cancellations from people who said people are saying mean things about you online. I think the biggest impact to that social media was how it made our team feel for a period of time, because it weighs heavily on people when they come to work.
Great, thanks, Jesse. And we just received a comment. It's not really a question, but a comment that just says that might be helpful. So they just wanted to state that we have temperature checks and screening every day for employees. We have, of course, had some people coming to work with symptoms and had to send them for testing. This was alarming at first, but now that it has happened a few times, it's helped everybody relax a bit and not panic every time someone has a cough. So they do spot-on coaching on arrival, and our leaders, and also do a quick reinforcement training at every daily shift briefing. So just wanted to share that comment.
Yeah, I think that's obviously fantastic best practices. Deerhurst employs right now around 350 people. And so quite frankly, we have somebody not feeling well and getting a test at any point in time. There's always somebody at Deerhurst who's not feeling well and has gotten a test. So I don't know what the number is, but it's probably 2 or 3 a week times the number of weeks we've been open, and every one of those tests has come back negative. So I think creating that environment, which was just described in that comment, where people know that they have the support to say I'm sick, and the support that they need to take the time off, is very, very helpful. So I completely agree. So I think,
I don't have any. Sorry, go ahead.
What I'll sort of say in closing is, what the news is going to do with it is they're going to do with it. You know, sharing whatever information you can as quickly as you can, I think is really important. And that's a bit of a, you know, again, Laura here, she also often reminds me that the best response is a quick and honest one. And I think, you know, just understanding the impact it's going to have on the team, first of all, the fear, and trying to explain to them that the professionals are telling us what to do. We would never put you in harm's way. And but also understanding to that first question or second question, how much the chatter online and the chatter in town can weigh heavily on your team, and making sure, you know, you're spending time with them and making sure they feel okay was probably the most important sort of piece of learning for us in there. So I'll leave you with that. Thanks so much for having me join you today.
Awesome, Jesse. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing that experience. I think it's invaluable for the members to hear firsthand on how that experience went, and you certainly gave us lots to think about from an opportunity, from a communication standpoint to best practices. So thank you.
You got it. Thanks very much, everybody.